Now that we know what state is, and now that we also understand how we can listen to events, we can continue working on this application and turn this more and more into an expense tracker. And one important piece is missing, for example, well, the capability to gather user input so that users can add their own expenses. This sounds fairly important for an expense tracker, and up to this point, it's not possible. So that's what we'll work on next. And for that, I will first of all add new components. And I'll add a new category of components, you could say, because thus far the expense components we have here are about outputting expenses, about showing these expenses here. Now I want to gather user input. And therefore, I'll add a new subfolder in the components folder, and I'll simply name it new expense, because ultimately that will be what the components here are about gathering the input for a new expense. And therefore in here we can add a new expense.js file, which will hold the new expense component in the end. And inside of this new expense component, I want to render a form where users can enter their expense data. So here I'll add the new expense const, where we have our component function. And of course, I export new expense here to make it available. And we can import React from React. As I mentioned, you technically don't need to add it. I covered this in the last course section, but I will still add it here, since you will see that in many React projects, and I want to again make it clear that JSX under the hood uses this React library. Now, as I mentioned, the goal with this component is to return a form in the end, a form for our inputs. And I also want to provide some styling around that form. So I'll first of all return a div, and then inside of that div return a form. Now, speaking of styling, we can also add a new expense.css file, and you find that file attached. You can either just paste in the styles you find there, or simply replace your new expense CSS file with mine. And then, of course, make sure you import new expense CSS. And that's all something you learned about in the last course section. That's all not directly related to state or user input, of course, but we'll get there. So now that we got this imported, let's add the new expense CSS class to this div, and let's now work on the form. And actually, I'll take that form and put it into a separate component, just so that the form logic lives in its own component, and this component is really lean again. Not something you have to do, but something I will do here, and I did talk about splitting components in the last course section as well. So we can add an expense form.js file, and in there create an expense form component function like this, and then of course also export that function expense form like this. And if you want, import React from React, even though it's not technically required. And I'll also set up some styles. So I'll add an expense form CSS file, and you also find that file attached, and you can replace yours with it. And then, just as we saw it multiple times, import that CSS file, the expense form CSS file. And now here in the expense form component, I will return this form element, and in there we'll then structure this form. Now, when it comes to structuring the form, for gathering expense data, I want to let users enter a title. I want to let them enter a date or pick a date with a date picker. And of course, users should be able to enter the amount. So we'll need 3 input fields. And for styling reasons, I'll put every input field in a div, where the div has a class of new-expense __ controls, or to be precise, that's actually a div which will hold all inputs. But then I'll create another div in there with a class of new-expense __ control for a single input. And in there we can now set up a label, for example, title for the first input, and then add an input of type text like this. as a self-closing tag here in React because these input elements don't have any content between the opening and closing tags. So we can and should write it as a self-closing tag in React. Now that's how we can create a first input here. And of course, these are all just default HTML elements, nothing React specific here. But we're soon going to add listeners to wait for user input, and we're soon going to manage some state with that. So this is some crucial groundwork which we have to do first. Now we can copy this div with the label and title and duplicate it to also have an input for the amount. The type here could be number, and we could set a minimum value of 0.01 and set up a step of 0.01 as well. And these are just default HTML attributes for input elements which control how this element can be used. And last but not least, I'll replicate the div one more time to also provide an input for the date. Set the type here to date, and this will then automatically give us a date picker. And I will also set up a min date and set this to January the 1st in 2019 and add a max date, which I'll set to 2022 and there December 31st. And I'm picking this min and max date because later we also want to add a filter where we only provide the years 2019 to 2022 for filtering. So I want to make sure that these are also the only years expenses can be set to. Of course, you can play around with these values. These are just some example values I'm working with here. Now we got all these inputs. We now also need a button to submit the form. And therefore, right before the form closes, I'll add a new div next to the other div, which holds the controls. And in there, I'll add a new expense actions class like this, new dash expense underscore underscore actions. And then in there, add a button where we say add expense like this. And I'll set the type of this button to submit so that when this button is pressed, since it's inside of this form will be submitted. Now that was a lot of work on the expense form. Now we can use the expense form in the new expense component. And therefore we of course want to import our expense form functional component. So this component function, we import this from newexpense.js without the file extension like this. And then here we can just render this and add it as a HTML element in our new expense function body. So that the new expense component will render the expense form component. That should be expense form, of course, my bad. So expense form is being rendered here. And now I want to render this entire new expense component in the app.js file. Because in there, in the end, we're combining all these components. So here I'll import new expense from /components/new expense/new expense. That's the path to this new expense JavaScript file. And then here, finally, instead of this dummy h2 tag, we can render new expense like this. If we now save this, this doesn't load because I have an error in the new expense JavaScript file. I'm importing expense form from new expense. That's of course not correct. I should be importing from expense form. That's where this component lives. Otherwise, I create an infinite loop, and that's this page. That's causing this page not to load. Now this works after changing this and restarting the server and revisiting localhost 3000. And now we have this form here at the top, which is great. Now we added the component, but the component is not doing anything. My next goal is now to make sure that we gather the inputs the user chooses here, maybe on every keystroke, or basically whenever the value in one of these inputs changes, so that we can, for example, log this to the console for a start. And that then as a next step, when the form is submitted, we step in our code and we take these gathered input values and combine them into a new expense object.